Horsemen of the Apocalypse are some of the most famous symbols of the end of the world in all of global culture. Their images are plastered on posters, in movies, video games, and tattoos. It seems like everyone knows them. Here they are: war, famine, death, and some guy on a white horse. But most people have no idea that the first horseman, the one on the white horse, is actually perhaps the most dangerous and cunning of the entire quartet. Not death, not war, but him. And to understand why, we need to go back nearly 2,000 years to a small, rocky island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos. But first, let's clear up one important thing. When we talk about the horsemen, we are talking about the text of the Revelation of John the Divine, the final book of the Christian Bible. And this is exactly where most people make an immediate mistake. They read it like a literal forecast of disasters or some kind of encrypted astrological calendar. That is a fundamentally wrong approach. Revelation is a text written in a very specific genre, which in ancient times was called apocalyptic literature. And this genre had its own rules, its own language, and its own codes. It is pretty much like how everyone today understands that if a character in a movie is walking down a dark street and ominous music starts playing, trouble is coming. That is a code. Everyone knows it. Apocalyptic literature was just the same, a language of codes that contemporary readers understood perfectly. But reading it 2,000 years later, we only see the surface and miss what lies beneath it. The island, the quarries, and the man who wrote it all. Patmos is a tiny island about 12 kilometers long. Today, tourists go there to take beautiful photos of white houses against the backdrop of the blue sea. But at the end of the 1st century AD, this place looked completely different. The Roman Empire used Patmos as a place of exile. They sent people there whom they didn't want to execute publicly, maybe because they were too famous, or perhaps too inconvenient for a simple execution. They were sent there to work in the quarries. Imagine this: scorching stone, salt, sea wind, and back-breaking labor from dawn till dusk. According to tradition, this is exactly where John, the author of Revelation, was stationed. Who exactly he was remains a topic of debate, and historians argue about it to this day. Some researchers believe it was the same Apostle John, the disciple of Jesus. Others assume the author was a different man named John, who was well known in the early Christian communities. For our story, though, that doesn't really matter. What matters is something else. This man was writing his message under a regime of real terror, and the terror was very concrete. The ruler at the time was Emperor Domitian, one of the darkest figures in Roman history. He demanded to be officially addressed as Lord and God, Dominus et Deus. Do you realize what that meant for Christians? For people who believed there was only one Lord and God, it was a direct, brutal choice. Either you participate in the state cult of the emperor, offer a sacrifice,
we will take back
and
the city.
recognize his divinity, or you are a criminal. Either you end up in the quarry, or worse. At the end of the 1st century, Christian communities were scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. These 7 churches
a quart of
are
wheat
exactly
for a
who
denarius,
Revelation
and 3
is
quarts
addressed
of
to.
barley for a
They were
denarius.
under immense pressure. Some Christians had already died. Some had renounced their faith. Others were hesitating. So John writes them a message, not of despair, but surprisingly, of hope. However, he writes it in a language that the Roman authorities won't easily decipher and use as an accusation. Hence all these numbers: beasts, horsemen, and seals. This isn't gibberish, it's a conspiracy. It is an encrypted letter smuggled into a besieged city. And here is another point crucial to understanding the horsemen. The text was written in Greek,
Secure the
yet
straps.
it is a very
Quick.
specific kind of Greek,
Easy,
loaded
boy.
with Semitic idioms
time.
and references
Keep
to
him
the
steady.
Old Testament
Tighten
on
the
literally
strap.
every single page. One scholar
We're
once
ready,
noted that
but he's
Revelation
not.
is
Control
written in
him.
Greek, but thinks in Hebrew. This matters because the Greek original contains nuances that often get lost in translation. And it is precisely from these nuances that the most fascinating interpretations are born. You'll see why in a moment. How the seals are opened, the structure of the vision. In the 6th chapter of Revelation, John describes how the Lamb, an image of Christ in Christian tradition, opens a sealed scroll, 7 seals. As each of the first 4 seals is removed, a horseman appears. This is our quartet. But before we look at each one individually, there is one detail you need to keep in mind. In apocalyptic literature, the number 4 represents the earth, the cardinal directions, and the completeness of the world. 4 winds, 4 corners of the earth. When the 4 horsemen appear, it's a signal. We are talking about something global, something that encompasses the entire world, all directions. This is not a local disaster, it is a system. And this systemic nature is arguably the core idea of the whole passage. The horsemen are not just 4 separate misfortunes, they are a chain reaction, an algorithm. One pulls the next one forward. To understand this is to understand why, throughout human history, the exact same disasters repeat themselves over and over in the exact same sequence. But let's take it one step at a time. The first horseman, the white horse, and the biggest riddle. So the first seal is broken. And here is what the text says. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. A white horse, a bow, a crown, a conqueror. And this is where it gets really interesting, because most people see this image and think, well, this is clearly something good. White is a symbol of purity, victory, and light. Maybe it's Christ himself or an angel. Such an interpretation does exist. In fact, some early Christian commentators thought exactly that. But there is another interpretation shared by most modern researchers, and it is far more captivating and unsettling. Look at it this way. All 3 of the other horsemen represent clear, undeniable evil. War, famine, death, no doubt about it. Why then should the first one be good? Could it be because he is pretending to be good? Could it be that his very danger lies in this? He looks like a victor, a savior, someone you can trust? The first clue is the bow. To the inhabitants of Asia Minor at the end of the 1st century, this was a very specific image. On the eastern border of the Roman Empire lived a powerful state, the Parthian Empire. And the Parthians were famous above all for one thing, their horse archers. They were so dangerous that they inflicted catastrophic defeats on Roman legions several times. The most famous was the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where the Parthians wiped out the army of Crassus. The legionaries, who were used to close-quarters combat, strict formations, and heavy infantry, simply didn't know what to do against riders who attacked at a full gallop, showered them with arrows, and vanished before anyone could engage in hand-to-hand combat. The famous Parthian shot is not just a metaphor. It was a real tactical maneuver. A rider at full gallop would turn completely around in the saddle and shoot over his shoulder at the pursuing enemy. That's where the phrase comes from. So to a reader back then, a bow on a white horse was very concrete. It was the image of an Eastern conqueror, dangerous and unpredictable. But there is a second clue, and it's even more important. The Greek word translated as crown is Stephanos. And here is a nuance that almost always gets lost in translation. In the Greek language, there are 2 different words for a crown. The first is diadema, a royal crown, a symbol of sovereign power, a throne, a dynasty, a legitimate ruler. The second is Stephanos, a victor's wreath, placed on an athlete at the games or given to a general after a triumph. It is not a monarch's crown, it is a prize. It is a reward for victory, something a person wins at a specific moment and carries forward. So what do we get? The first horseman rides a white horse, a symbol of victory. He has a bow, a weapon that strikes from afar, unnoticed. And on his head, He wears not the diadema of a legitimate king, but a Stephanos, the wreath of a conqueror. He is not a legitimate ruler. He is someone who seizes power under the guise of a victor. This is the root of one of the most widespread interpretations. The first horseman is the image of a false messiah, a false savior, someone who arrives promising victory, using beautiful words, putting on a show of triumph, and that is precisely why he is more dangerous than all the others. War is visible right away. Famine is felt physically. Death is the most obvious evil. But a false savior initially sparks ecstasy. People open the gates for him. They applaud him. They follow him voluntarily. There is another interpretation of the first horseman that stems not from politics, but from biology, so to speak. Some researchers see the white horseman as the embodiment of an epidemic, a plague. Here is why. In the Old Testament, in the prophecy of Ezekiel, there is a famous list of 4 disastrous judgments: sword, famine, wild beasts, and plague. This is remarkably close to our 4 horsemen. If we overlay this template, the role of the first fits a plague perfectly. A disease that arrives quietly, invisibly, striking people down before they even realize what is happening. A sickness that looks manageable at first, but turns into a catastrophe. Yet I think these two interpretations don't contradict each other. A false messiah and a plague are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. Both represent something that infiltrates a system under the guise of something acceptable or even desirable before revealing its true nature. The white color is a disguise, and that is perhaps the main message of the first horseman. Not everything that looks like a victory is a victory. The second horseman, the red horse and what is worse than war. The second seal is broken. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people slay each other. To him was given a large sword. A red horse, a large sword, taking peace from the earth. It seems straightforward, this is war. But let's slow down here, because there is a crucial nuance in the original text. The phrase, slay each other, in the Greek original, this doesn't just mean war against an enemy. The verb John uses implies mutual destruction, a slaughter within the same group. This isn't 2 armies fighting on a battlefield, it's something else. This brings to mind the Greek word stasis. It is one of the key concepts of ancient political thought, and it is incredibly hard to translate with just one word. Stasis means internal strife, civil war, the unraveling of social unity. It is when people who live side by side suddenly split into camps and start destroying each other. Not outsiders, but neighbors. Not external enemies, but their own people. The Greek historian Thucydides, describing the horrors of the civil war on the island of Corcyra in the 5th century BC, wrote something that reads like a prophecy for millennia to come. He said that during a period of stasis, words change their meaning. What used to be called reckless audacity is now called a friend's courage. What was called prudence is now called cowardice. What was called moderation is now called weakness. When an internal fracture begins in society, language is the first thing to collapse. And right after language comes trust. This is what makes the second horseman truly terrifying. He doesn't just kill people, he kills the very fabric of society. He destroys basic trust between humans, the thing that keeps any civilization standing. Trust in a neighbor, a merchant, an official, a doctor. When this trust shatters, society begins to crumble from within, even without an outside enemy. Look at the logic of this sequence. After the first horseman arrives with false promises of victory, disillusionment inevitably follows. The people who believed in the false savior discover they were conned. Or they split into those who still believe and those who no longer do. And right there, you have stasis. Neighbors are already eyeing each other with suspicion. The words traitor and enemy are already being hurled at people who, just yesterday, were one of their own. The red color of the horse is the color of fire and blood, a very concrete physical image. And the large sword is not a graceful dueling weapon. It is something heavy and hacking, designed for mass slaughter. It is the image of a butchery, not a battle. There is a historical example that perfectly illustrates the second horseman, and it's from our relatively recent past. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. Brother fought against brother. Neighbor turned in neighbor. Priests executed workers, and workers executed priests. A country that shared a common language, a common history, and a common culture ripped itself completely in half. And that wound hasn't healed even after decades. That is what the second horseman does. He doesn't just kill people, he tears apart the very concept of us. The third horseman, the black horse in the economist's scales. The third seal is broken. I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." A black horse, scales, prices, famine. This is arguably the most economic of all the horsemen. To understand exactly what is happening here, we need to break down the numbers. Because behind these prices hides a very precise and brutal picture of a social catastrophe. First, let's look at the day's wages. In the original text, this is a denarius. What was a denarius in the first century? It was the daily wage of a day laborer. Not a wealthy man, not a specialized craftsman, just an ordinary guy who gets hired for one day's work. It's essentially the minimum daily wage of today. A person works all day and receives exactly 1 denarius. A quart of wheat, or a koenix in Greek, is roughly 1 liter of grain. That is approximately what one adult needs to not die of hunger over the course of a day. Not to eat until they're full, but just to survive. Now let's do the math. 1 denarius equals 1 quart of wheat. A man works all day long and receives exactly enough food to keep himself alive for one day. Zero net, nothing left over. What if he has a family? What if he has children? What if he gets sick and can't work? For comparison, in normal times, 1 denarius could buy anywhere from 8 to 12 quarts of wheat. So what the third horseman is describing is a price spike of about 8 to 12 times. This isn't just inflation, this is a catastrophe. And here is a very critical detail. The voice says, "Do not damage the oil and the wine." While the price of bread has skyrocketed into the stratosphere, olive oil and wine remain untouched. Why? There are several layers of meaning here. The first is purely practical. Olive trees and vineyards are long-term investments. An olive tree only starts bearing fruit several years after planting, and vineyards take time too. This is the property of wealthy people, landowners. Grain, on the other hand, is what peasants plant and harvest every single year. In a crisis, grain is the first thing to become scarce because its stocks are finite and deplete quickly. But olive groves and vineyards don't just vanish. They keep producing fruit, and people keep guarding them because they are someone's valuable property. The second layer is social. In the ancient world, oil and wine were goods for the middle and upper classes. Not pure luxury items, but certainly not a poor man's daily food either. A poor man ate bread with water and salt. Oil and wine were for those who could afford them. So the picture we get is this. Bread, the food of survival, the food of the poor, becomes completely unaffordable. Meanwhile, luxury items consumed by people with money continue to supply the market. This is not an abstract famine where there is absolutely nothing to eat. This is famine in the midst of abundance. It's when there is wine and oil available in the market, but you don't have the money to buy them because all your cash went into a single crust of bread. This is famine as a social injustice, not just a natural disaster. The black color of the horse is the color of mourning and death, but it is also the color of emptiness, of absence, empty shelves, empty stomachs, empty wallets. The scales in the rider's hand are not the scales of justice. They are the scales of a merchant weighing every tiny grain. When food starts being weighed down to the gram, that is when the third horseman has arrived. Notice how the logic keeps driving the chain reaction. After a false victor and a civil war, production and supply chains inevitably collapse. Wars destroy fields. Internal conflicts halt trade. The people who are supposed to sow and harvest the crops are either killed, fighting, or displaced as refugees. And then the third horseman arrives, not because nature suddenly turned malicious, but because humans broke the system that fed them. The Roman Empire of the first century had a very vivid example of this dynamic. Egypt was Rome's primary breadbasket. Massive quantities of grain shipped from Egypt to Rome every year. If anything broke down in that chain, a bad harvest, a political crisis, pirates at sea, prices in Rome immediately went through the roof. The urban poor, who depended entirely on buying bread, found themselves on the brink of survival. This happened repeatedly. People of the first century knew exactly what the third horseman looked like. He visited regularly. The fourth horseman, the pale horse and the most terrifying name. The fourth seal is broken. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. A pale horse. The rider is Death. Hades follows him. Let's start with the color. Translations usually say pale, sometimes ashen pale, but the Greek original uses the word chloros. This is the root we know from the word chlorophyll, the green pigment in plants. Literally, it means green, but not a vibrant, living green, rather a greenish gray, the color of decay, the color of a corpse when necrosis begins. This isn't some abstract paleness. It is a very concrete, physical, almost physiological image of death. Anyone who has seen a corpse knows this color. John did not choose this word by accident. Next, and Hades was following close behind him. The Greek text literally says Hades, the realm of the dead, the underworld. Death rides out in front, and Hades moves right behind. This isn't just a poetic image. It's a functional description of a process. First, death produces the bodies, and then Hades swallows them up. Death is like the reaper. Hades is like the barn where everything cut down gets hauled. And here is another detail people frequently overlook. The fourth horseman is given authority over a fourth of the earth. This matters. This is not the end of everything. It is a massive but limited catastrophe. A quarter of the earth. In apocalyptic literature, this meant an enormous amount, but not all. It is a warning, not a final sentence. Now look at his tools: sword, famine, plague, and the wild beasts of the earth. See that? Everything the previous horseman did is listed here as the fourth horseman's arsenal. The war of the second horseman, the famine of the third, the disease you could already spot in the first, all of it converges in the fourth. He isn't just death as an abstraction. He is the cumulative total of the entire system. And one more detail: the wild beasts of the earth. This seems odd. What's up with the beasts? Why are they here? But this, too, was a very concrete image for that era. When human civilization collapses, cities empty out, fields overgrow, roads fall into disrepair, wild animals return. This is not a metaphor, it's a real process. Wolves that were once driven away from villages come back. Wild boars encroach on abandoned fields. Large predators, bears or leopards in the Middle East, reappear near human dwellings. When humans lose the strength to defend their space, nature takes it back. This is a highly accurate observation of what civilizational collapse looks like from a biological perspective. The fourth horseman is not just death as a concept, it is systemic collapse. It's when all the defense mechanisms of human society, the military, medicine, agriculture, trade, stop working simultaneously. And then ordinary threats that civilization usually keeps under control, diseases, hunger, violence, wild nature, flood in all at once. Why they ride together, systemic logic. Now let's step back and look at the whole picture, because the most important takeaway in this text is not each horseman individually, but how they are interconnected. The first horseman creates an illusion of victory. Euphoria grips society. We won. We found our leader. We are heading toward a grand future. But this euphoria is built on lies, manipulation, and false promises. Sooner or later, reality sends the bill. Then comes the second horseman. Disillusionment sours into anger. Anger looks for someone to blame and finds them right inside society itself. A fracture begins. Yesterday's allies become enemies. An internal war breaks out, whether hot or cold, with weapons or just with words. But it's a war. Society begins to consume itself. And while society is busy with self-destruction, there is no one left to work, no one to trade, no one to protect supply chains. Fields are left unseeded, or they are seeded, but there's no one to harvest the crops. Trade routes are severed. Currency loses its value. The third horseman arrives, famine and economic collapse. Finally, when all three previous disasters have utterly broken society's immunity, both physical and social, the fourth horseman arrives. What would have been a manageable misfortune under normal circumstances becomes a total catastrophe. An epidemic that could have been localized earlier now kills millions because people are weakened by hunger. Violence that could have been stopped earlier now spreads like wildfire because there are no institutions left to contain it. Wild beasts return to emptying cities, both literally and metaphorically. This is not a sci-fi script. It is an algorithm that has played out in history over and over again. And what's particularly crucial is that there is no mystical outside source involved. The horsemen don't drop out of the sky from nowhere. They are summoned by humans themselves. The first horseman becomes possible because people want to believe in simple solutions to complex problems. The second happens because when that simple solution fails, it's easier to blame your neighbor than to admit your own mistake. The third arrives because conflict destroys what took years to build. And the fourth steps in when there is simply no strength left to resist. How this algorithm worked in history. Let's step outside of John's world for a minute and look at the 20th century, because the 20th century is perhaps the most vivid demonstration of the horsemen working in real history. Take Germany after World War I. The country was defeated, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, and crushed by reparations. The economy was tanking. And then the first horseman appears, a man on a white horse, wearing a victor's wreath, who says, "I know who is to blame. I know the path to victory. Follow me." He comes with simple answers to complex questions. He is met with euphoria. People voluntarily hand him the gates of power. Next, the second horseman begins. A civil war fought not with weapons initially, but against minorities, against outsiders within, against those appointed as guilty. First it's words, then laws, then Kristallnacht, then camps. Society is ripped into us and them. Trust is obliterated. The third horseman had already partially arrived before: the Great Depression, unemployment, starvation in some regions. But now he returns as a direct result of the war unleashed by the first. Ruined cities, obliterated production, a starving population. And then the fourth. 60 million dead in World War II, the Holocaust, atomic bombs, millions dying from diseases and hunger that followed the war. Bubonic plague in some areas, typhus, dysentery. And you know what? At the very beginning of this chain was a single man whom people called a savior. One false messiah, one white horseman. Or take another example, one even closer to John's text chronologically, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's the exact same sequence, just stretched over centuries. First, an endless parade of emperors, each promising to restore greatness and stability. Barracks emperors who ruled for just a few months, each one a conqueror, each with his own Stephanos. Next came civil wars following one after another. Then, economic collapse, the crisis of the 3rd century, hyperinflation where coins lost value practically by the month, and peasants reverted to bartering because money had become meaningless. Finally, epidemics that hollowed out cities, barbarian invasions, the disappearance of trade routes, and wild nature returning to abandoned provinces. And once again, no external force, not gods, not natural disasters as the root cause. It was an algorithm triggered from deep within the system itself. What this text tells us about human nature. But here is what is truly fascinating. John is writing this letter to people who are under monstrous pressure. They are being persecuted, killed, and exiled. You would think he would write something that blamed their suffering on an outside cause. Evil Rome is doing all this. Evil Domitian is doing all this. And partially, yes, those images are in the text. Rome is coded under the name of Babylon. Domitian is under the number of the beast. But look at the structure of the horsemen. They don't come from the outside, from some hostile world. They appear when the seals are removed, meaning when something that already existed in a hidden state is uncovered. It's as if John is saying, these disasters are not something being done to you. They are something unfolding from within you, from your collective choices, from your collective blindness. The first horseman is our need for simple answers and charismatic leaders. We open the gates to false messiahs ourselves. We place the victor's wreath on their heads ourselves. The second horseman is our inability to handle disappointment without searching for a scapegoat. We split ourselves into hostile camps. We turn our neighbors into enemies ourselves. The third horseman is the result of our failure to maintain complex systems of cooperation under pressure. We destroy trade ties, production chains, and social capital, and then act surprised that there's nothing to eat. The fourth horseman is what remains when all the protective barriers of civilization are broken down. It's not the revenge of the gods. It is simply reality without the safety nets we built. When there is no medicine, diseases come. When there is no army and order, violence comes. When there is no agriculture, hunger comes. When there are no cities and villages, the beasts return. In this sense, the horsemen are not so much a prophecy about the end of the world as they are a diagnosis. A highly accurate, merciless diagnosis of how human society is wired and where its systemic vulnerabilities lie. The mirror. There is a literary genre known as speculum, or a mirror. In the Middle Ages, these were texts intended for rulers. Look here, this is what a good ruler looks like. This is what a bad one looks like. This is where one choice leads, and this is where another goes. A sort of moral handbook in the form of images and stories. Many scholars believe that Revelation is in a way a mirror too, only not for rulers, but for all of humanity. Look here, this is what the road to catastrophe looks like. Here is the first step, you accept a false winner. Here is the second, you fracture your society from within. Here is the third, you destroy what feeds you. Here is the fourth, you reap the final tally. If you read the text this way, not as a prediction of something inevitable, but as a description of something preventable, it takes on a completely different meaning. It stops being a scary bedtime story about the end of the world and becomes something like a safety manual, or if you prefer, a warning label on a package. Caution, misuse may cause catastrophe. Interpretations through the centuries, how our understanding of the horsemen shifted. It's fascinating to track how different eras viewed the horsemen in their own way, and what that says about those eras themselves. Early Christian commentators, those living in the first centuries AD, saw the horsemen primarily as concrete events of their own time. For some of them, the first horseman was Christ, or the gospel spreading across the world. For others, it was Nero or Domitian. The second horseman was the Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem. The third represented the economic crises shaking the empire. The fourth meant the plagues that wiped out a huge chunk of the empire's population multiple times during its early centuries. In the Middle Ages, the focus shifted. The horsemen came to be understood as universal forces operating throughout history. The Black Death, the Great Plague that wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, seemed to people at the time to be the literal embodiment of the Fourth Horseman. And not without reason. The epidemic was followed by massive social upheaval, peasant revolts, and economic collapse, the whole package. During the Reformation era, the 16th and 17th centuries, the horsemen were projected onto specific political enemies once again. Protestants saw the Pope in the first horseman. Catholics saw Luther or Calvin. Both camps were absolutely certain they were seeing the pure truth, and that their opponent was the false prophet. In the 20th century, interpretations grew even richer because the 20th century provided so many historical examples that the horsemen began to feel almost literal. World War I and II, the Spanish flu that killed more people than the war itself, the Cold War with its threat of nuclear annihilation, the Holodomor, various genocides, all of this was reflected in the images of the Four Horsemen. And what's interesting, in every single era, people were convinced that they were the ones living through the arrival of the horsemen. That in itself says something. Maybe it's not that the horsemen come just once, at the very, very end. Maybe it's that they come every single time humanity makes a specific set of mistakes, over and over again. And every time, they follow the exact same algorithm. What remains off camera? Hope in a text of terror. Here is one more point that is vital for context. Revelation is often perceived as pure terror, beasts, disasters, the end of everything. But that is a one-sided reading. There is something else in the text. After the description of all the horrors, after all the plagues and catastrophes, the image of the New Jerusalem appears at the very end of Revelation, a city where God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. This is not a book solely about horror. It is a book about the fact that on the other side of horror, there is something else. For the people John was addressing, the ones sitting in the quarries of Patmos, or hiding from Domitian's informants in Ephesus, this wasn't just a pretty metaphor. It was a concrete lifeline, a reason to endure, a reason not to betray, a reason not to break down. And that is where the power of the horsemen's imagery lies. They are terrifying. They are real. They do come. But their arrival is not infinite. They were given power over a fourth of the earth, not the entire earth. And behind them comes something else. The finale, why we need to know this today. So, let's wrap up our journey to Patmos and back. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are not just an ancient image of the end of the world, a campfire ghost story for kids, or material for dark fantasy posters. They are a highly precise, carefully thought-out model of how societies disintegrate. A model that is nearly 2,000 years old and hasn't aged a single day. The first horseman, white, with a bow and a victor's wreath, warns us about the trap of false winners. It tells us that the most dangerous thing is not obvious evil, but that which looks like a victory. This is always relevant because humans always crave simple fixes. There is always a market for white horses and beautiful wreaths. The second horseman, red with a large sword, reminds us that the most horrific war is a civil war. A war fought not against an external enemy, but against ourselves. It warns us that when trust breaks down in a society, everything else collapses with it. And it shows us that words are also weapons you can kill with. The third horseman, black, with scales, tells us that famine and economic collapse are almost never purely natural disasters. Usually there is a system behind them, a system of distribution, a system of values, a system dictating who gets it and who doesn't. Do not damage the wine and the oil, but let bread cost you your life. The fourth horseman, pale green, the color of a corpse, with death on his face and Hades at his back, is the final score. It is what a society turns into after passing through the first three. It is not an inevitability, it is a result. And here is the most crucial takeaway. This chain reaction is not unavoidable. It can be broken at any link. If a society can spot a false winner, the first horseman fails to pass. If a society manages to keep internal trust intact under pressure, the second fails to pass. If a society can maintain fair systems of distribution, the third fails to pass. And if the first three didn't pass, the fourth simply has nothing to do. John wrote this from the island of Patmos in a quarry under Roman terror. He had no clue his text would be read by someone in the 21st century, but he was describing something deeply fundamental, something about the nature of human societies and their vulnerabilities. 2,000 years later, it still sounds like a warning, like a mirror. Look into it closely, because the white horse is already being saddled.